Welcome to this new journey. Tonight, we begin a peaceful exploration of ancient Egypt, a land shaped by sand, stars, and the quiet flow of the Nile. This series is designed to help you relax, unwind, and drift gently into sleep while discovering one of the most fascinating civilizations in human history. Together, we will travel back thousands of years, long before great kingdoms existed, long before pyramids rose into the sky, back to a time when Egypt was nothing more than a river, a desert, and the first humans learning to live in harmony with nature. So get comfortable, breathe slowly, and let the calm rhythm of this story guide you. Tonight, we start with the beginning, the moment when the Nile first shaped life in the land that would one day become Egypt. Part 1. When the Nile first spoke. Long before Egypt became a kingdom of pharaohs and temples, it was simply a quiet stretch of land where the desert met a single source of life, the Nile. At that time, the world around the river was mostly empty and silent. The wind moved across the sand with soft, endless breaths, and the sky stretched from horizon to horizon without interruption. The Nile was the only thing that changed, the only thing that moved, and the only thing that offered hope. Each year, the river rose slowly, gently overflowing onto the dry ground. When the water receded, it left behind a dark, rich soil that seemed almost magical compared to the pale desert around it. This soil became the foundation of everything. It allowed plants to grow, animals to gather, and eventually, humans to settle. The first people who lived along the Nile were small groups of hunters, gatherers, and early farmers. They built simple homes from clay and reeds, close enough to the river to use its water every day, but far enough not to be swept away by the seasonal floods. Life followed a calm rhythm. Mornings were filled with the sound of birds waking along the riverbanks. Days were spent fishing in narrow boats made from bundled papyrus reeds, tending to small patches of crops, or preparing food under the warm sun. Evenings were quiet, with families gathering around small fires while the sky slowly filled with stars. In those early nights, the people of the Nile looked up and observed the heavens carefully, noticing patterns, cycles, and lights that seemed connected to the world around them. They didn't have gods yet, not in the form we know today, but they could feel that something powerful guided the river, the seasons, and the stars. The Nile shaped everything. It determined where people lived, what they ate, and how they moved. It connected distant settlements like a long, natural road of water. Boats traveled gently from one village to another, carrying fish, grain, pottery, and stories. With time, the small communities along the river grew, and people began to share more than goods. They shared knowledge, ideas, and the early foundations of culture. As these villages became more numerous, something changed in the way people saw the world. They began to feel that the river was not just a source of life, but a force that brought order and stability. In contrast, the desert represented chaos, an endless, unpredictable emptiness. This simple idea, order against chaos, became one of the earliest concepts that shaped Egyptian thought long before formal religion appeared. The first leaders were not kings or warriors. They were skilled hunters, wise elders, and respected organizers who knew how to guide their people through the seasons. They understood the river's patience and the harshness of the desert. They protected their families, made decisions for their villages, and slowly contributed to the growth of a more structured society. Over generations, these settlements began to resemble early communities rather than temporary camps. People had routines, shared responsibilities, and a growing sense that they belonged to something larger than themselves. The Nile was at the center of everything. Without it, nothing would survive. With it, anything seemed possible. This was the first whisper of Egypt, a civilization not yet born, but slowly forming, a land where nature shaped humanity, where time moved gently, and where simple lives laid the foundation for one of the greatest cultures the world would ever know. And as the villages continued to grow, and the land became more organized, the next great transformation was approaching, the rise of the two lands. PART2, villages of clay and light. As the centuries passed, the small groups living along the Nile slowly transformed into true villages, quiet, modest communities built from clay, wood, and the simple materials the land provided. These villages were not large or crowded. They were peaceful clusters of homes, each one shaped by hand, with walls smoothed by water and sun, and roofs made from bundles of dried reeds. From a distance, they looked like small patches of warm color placed gently along the river's edge, blending naturally with the landscape. Life inside these early villages followed a calm and predictable rhythm. At sunrise, the sky glowed with soft shades of gold and rose, and people began their day with simple tasks. Farmers checked their small fields, touching the soil to see if it was ready for planting. Children helped gather water in clay jars, balancing them carefully as they walked back home. Women ground grain using smooth stones, their movements steady and familiar, filling the morning air with a gentle, repetitive sound. Despite their simplicity, these villages were full of life. Chickens wandered freely around the homes, goats grazed near the river, and dogs rested lazily in the shade. The Nile itself was always present, flowing quietly nearby, offering fish, water for crops, and a sense of security. People depended on it for everything, and its calm presence shaped the way they lived, moved, and thought. Inside the homes, daily routines were guided by practicality. Clay ovens baked simple bread. Reed mats covered the floors. Small oil lamps provided light during the evening, filling the rooms with a warm, flickering glow. The smell of cooked grains, fresh fish, and herbs drifted through the village at dinner time, creating an atmosphere that felt safe and familiar. As the day continued, villagers shared tasks and responsibilities. Some shaped pottery, turning wet clay into bowls, jars, and cups. Others prepared wooden tools or wove baskets from palm fibers. Everything was created by hand, slowly and carefully. Craftsmanship was not about perfection, but about patience and experience passed down through generations. When the heat of the day became too strong, people rested under the shade of palm trees or inside their homes. The village would become almost silent, except for the soft sound of the wind moving across the fields and the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the river. This midday quiet was a part of life, a gentle pause shared by everyone. In the late afternoon, when the sun softened again, the village woke up. Fishermen returned with their catches. Farmers checked their fields once more. Children ran through the open spaces, their laughter echoing between the homes. Stories were told, often simple tales about animals, the river, and the lessons learned from nature. These stories were not written yet, but they were remembered, repeated, and slowly became part of the culture that would later define Egypt. When night finally arrived, the sky revealed a breathtaking view of stars. Without cities or lights, the heavens above the Nile were bright and full. Families sat outside their homes, watching the constellations rise, move, and fade. Some believed the stars were signs that explained the passing of seasons. Others simply admired their beauty, comforted by their constant presence. These early villages were the heart of Egypt before Egypt existed. They were places where people lived in harmony with the land, where every object was made with purpose, and where each day felt like a small step towards something greater. Without realizing it, These villagers were laying the foundations of a civilization that would one day astonish the world with its achievements. And as their numbers grew and their communities expanded, a new stage in their journey was slowly unfolding. The transformation of simple settlements into organized regions. The early beginnings of what would later be known as the Two Lands. Part 3, the River of Dreams. As the villages along the Nile continued to grow, the river became more than just a source of water. It became the silent guide of every life, the center of every thought, and the heart of every dream. Everything began with the Nile, and everything returned to it. People soon realized that the river did not only shape the land, it shaped them too. The Nile had a rhythm, a pulse that could be felt throughout the year. Its annual flood arrived like a quiet promise. First came the rising waters, slowly spreading across the fields, turning the dry earth into a reflective mirror of the sky. Then came the retreat, a gentle withdrawal that left behind a rich, dark soil. This soil was the foundation of life, and those who lived by the river trusted it completely. They planted their seeds in it, raised their hopes on it, and depended on it to feed their families. This yearly cycle created a deep sense of stability, something rare in the ancient world. For the people who lived along its banks, the Nile was almost alive. It seemed to breathe, to move with intention, to bring order to an environment dominated by the harsh, unpredictable desert. The river was patient and generous, and its calm surface often made people forget how powerful it truly was. Without the Nile, nothing could survive. With it, life flourished. As the villages expanded, people began to give meaning to the river's behavior. They watched how the flood arrived at the same time every year, how the water rose in a predictable pattern, and how the seasons changed almost as if following an unseen plan. Slowly, they started to believe that a divine force must be guiding this natural miracle. The earliest Egyptian spiritual beliefs were shaped not by temples or sacred books, but by the simple observation of water flowing through the desert. Each stage of the river's cycle inspired a different feeling. The flood brought relief, knowing the soil would be renewed. The planting season brought hope, with families working together to place seeds in the damp earth. The growing season brought patience, as people watched green fields spread along the riverbanks. And the harvest brought gratitude, a sense of harmony between humans, nature, and the mysterious force that controlled the river. Travel along the Nile also became a part of daily life. Wooden boats drifted across the surface, moving quietly from one settlement to another, carried by the gentle current or pushed by simple square sails. These boats transported grain, fish, pottery, and baskets, but they also carried ideas, songs, and stories. Through these slow journeys, the villages remained connected, sharing customs and knowledge that gradually formed a unified culture. For many, a boat ride on the Nile was not just a journey, it was a moment of peace. The water reflected the sky, creating an endless ribbon of shimmering light. The soft splash of oars, the movement of reeds along the shore, and the call of birds in the distance created a melody that never tired the ears. People could sit silently in their boats for hours, watching the landscape change from fields to palm groves to smooth stretches of desert. At night, the river became even more magical. The moonlight rested on its surface, creating a silver path that stretched toward the horizon. Some believed that the spirits of ancestors traveled along this shining path. Others thought the moon was watching over them, guiding lost thoughts back to calmness. Whatever the belief, the Nile's presence brought comfort and a deep sense of belonging. Over time, the river became the foundation of early myths. stories that explained why the floods came, what created the stars, and how life began. These stories were simple at first, but they grew richer as people shared them across generations. Without realizing it, the people along the Nile were creating the earliest ideas that would later form the grand Egyptian religion. But at this stage, these beliefs were gentle, small, and deeply connected to nature. The Nile was not just a river. It was the beginning of identity, community, and imagination. It taught the people about cycles, balance, and the beauty of harmony. And as the villages continued to expand and connect, the world along the Nile was slowly preparing for its next transformation, a shift from countless small communities to the first organized regions, the seeds of what would become the two lands of ancient Egypt. Part 4: The Rise of the Two Lands. As generations followed one another, the world along the Nile continued to grow and transform. What had once been a scattering of small, independent villages slowly began to take on a new shape. People were traveling more frequently, exchanging goods, ideas, and traditions. And with every new connection formed along the river, something deeper and more powerful began to take root. The sense that these lands, though different, were part of a larger whole. Yet, despite the unity brought by the Nile, the geography of Egypt naturally divided the land into two distinct regions, each with its own identity, character, and way of life. These were the beginnings of what would later be known as the Two Lands. Upper Egypt in the south, stretching along a narrow ribbon of fertile valley, and Lower Egypt in the north, spreading across the wide green delta where the river met the Mediterranean Sea. At this early stage, the differences between the two regions were subtle but noticeable. In the south, where the valley was narrow and bordered by high cliffs, life felt more focused and linear. Villages were arranged in long rows following the shape of the river. People here became expert boat builders, learning to navigate the tight bends and shifting currents of the waterway. Their homes were often built near the base of the cliffs, where caves provided natural shade and coolness during the hottest days. The air was dry, the nights were crisp, and the people lived close to the land, depending heavily on the river for survival. In contrast, the north was a world of openness. The delta spread outward like a green fan, creating countless streams, ponds, and lakes. The soil was deep and rich, supporting large fields of grains and vegetables. Life here felt broader and more abundant. Villages had more space to grow, and families could cultivate larger plots of land. The air was more humid, and the breezes carried the scent of distant marshes and the sea. This region, with its network of waterways, encouraged fishing, reed gathering, and trade with lands beyond the Mediterranean. Though connected by the Nile, the people of these two regions gradually developed their own customs, dialects, and traditions. Their pottery looked different. Their houses were shaped differently. Even the symbols they carved into early objects varied from one region to another. These small distinctions did not create conflict at first. Instead, they added to the richness of the world that was slowly becoming Egypt. As time passed, each region also formed its own leadership. In Lower Egypt, chiefs managed the sprawling farmlands, organizing harvests and protecting the fertile delta from floods. In Upper Egypt, leaders oversaw the narrow villages along the valley, managing hunting routes, stone quarries, and water access. These early leaders were not kings yet, but they held influence and responsibility. They settled disputes, formed alliances, and ensured the safety of their people. With stronger leadership came stronger identity. The southern communities began to see themselves as belonging to a shared territory shaped by cliffs and valley. The northern communities, with their open lands and wide skies, felt connected to one another through farming and trade. The concept of two lands was not yet fully defined, but it was slowly emerging in the minds of the people. The land itself encouraged this distinction. In the valley of the south, the Nile flowed fast and straight, carving a clear path. In the delta of the north, it split into many branches, creating a sense of openness and unpredictability. These natural shapes influenced how people saw the world around them. The south valued structure, linear movement, and the steady path of the river. The north valued abundance, expansion, and the freedom of open space. Despite their differences, the regions were deeply connected by the Nile's rhythm. Boats traveled between them, carrying goods that each region lacked. The north sent fish, grains, and marsh plants southward. The south sent stone, crafted tools, and animal products northward. These exchanges created a bond that no natural boundary could break. Over time, elders and storytellers began to speak of the land of the reed and papyrus in the north and the land of the lotus in the south. These images were more than poetry. They were early signs of cultural identity. People started carving these symbols into pottery, painting them on walls, and weaving them into fabrics. Slowly, the idea that Egypt was made of two complementary halves began to grow. As the population increased and settlements expanded, cooperation became essential. Floods had to be managed. Fields needed coordinated planting. Boats had to travel safely between the regions. This growing need for organization began to shape a new type of leadership, something more structured, more ambitious, and more unified. Little by little, the thought began to appear. Maybe the two lands could work together under a single vision, a single idea, a single guiding hand. It was not a political dream yet, nor a military ambition. It was a natural evolution, born from the rhythm of the Nile and the growing complexity of human life along its banks. This period marked the beginning of something immense, something that would eventually lead to great leaders, powerful symbols, and the unification of a civilization. But for now, the two lands remain separate, each growing in its own way, each forming its identity, each preparing, without knowing it, for the biggest transformation in its history. And as the villages grew stronger and traditions deepened, a new presence began to appear across Egypt. Early forms of gods, myths, and spiritual practices that would soon shape the beliefs of an entire nation. Part 5: Whispering Gods and Ancient Myths. As the two lands developed their own identities, something subtle and deeply human began to grow within the hearts of the people. Living so closely with the cycles of nature, watching the river rise and fall, observing the sun climb each morning and disappear each night, feeling the desert winds shift and change, gave birth to questions that had no simple answers. Over time, these questions transformed into stories, and the stories transformed into the earliest myths of ancient Egypt. These early myths did not appear suddenly. They emerged slowly, shaped by daily life and by the natural world that surrounded the people. The Nile, with its dependable flood, became a symbol of renewal and kindness. The desert, harsh and endless, became the representation of danger and chaos. The sun, steady in its path across the sky, became a guardian. The stars, bright and countless, became guides. In the beginning, the gods were not portrayed with complex forms or elaborate temples. They existed more like quiet presences, felt rather than seen, understood rather than defined. People believed that every part of the world contained a spirit or a force. The waters, the animals, the sky, the land. These forces were treated with respect, because they held life in their hands. The most important of these early forces was the sun. Each morning, when the sky began to glow with shades of orange and gold, people felt hope rising with it. They believed the sun brought warmth, protection, and order. Without it, darkness and uncertainty would take over. As the sun moved across the sky, it became a symbol of life itself, a cycle of birth, journey, and rest. In time, people gave this force a name, Ra, the one who travels the sky and brings light to the world. At night, when the sun disappeared, another world seemed to awaken. The stars appeared in patterns that repeated endlessly, season after season. These patterns guided travelers and marked the times for planting and harvesting. People began to imagine that the sky was a great canvas of symbols created by unseen beings. They believed that the stars were the glowing souls of ancestors who watched over them, offering comfort during the long, quiet nights. The river also gained a sacred identity. Because the Nile brought life to the land, people imagined it as a divine presence that flowed between worlds. They believed it carried messages from the spiritual realm. The waters became associated with both creation and transformation. Early stories described a time when the world rose from a vast silent ocean, just as the land reappeared every year when the flood receded. This idea became the foundation of one of the oldest Egyptian myths of creation. Animals, too, played an important role in shaping early beliefs. Cats, with their graceful movements and sharp senses, became symbols of protection. Falcons, soaring high above the land with effortless majesty, became symbols of vision and power. The crocodile, powerful and silent beneath the water's surface, became a reminder of the river's hidden strength. These animals were not worshipped as gods, but as sacred reflections of the natural forces around them. As these beliefs slowly grew more complex, people began to tell stories about how the world came to be, why the seasons changed, and what happened after death. These stories were whispered at night beside fires, shared between generations, and carved into the earliest symbols on pottery and tools. They gave meaning to the world and comfort during difficult times. They also created a shared understanding, a spiritual bond that connected families across distant villages. Over time, certain stories became particularly important. One tale described how the world began when a single mound of earth emerged from the endless waters. Another told of a great creator who shaped life with intention and care. These stories varied from place to place, but their essence remained the same. Life was sacred, ordered, and part of something larger than human understanding. As people shared these stories, their sense of identity deepened. The myths brought unity to the two lands, giving the people a shared way to understand the world. They also laid the foundation for the great religion of Egypt that would later inspire temples, rituals, and grand monuments. But at this stage in history, these beliefs were simple, pure, and close to nature. With each passing season, the myths continued to evolve. They shaped the people's relationship with the land, with each other, and with the unseen forces they believed guided their lives. And as this spiritual landscape grew richer, something new began to emerge. The first signs of true leadership. Leaders who claimed not only the responsibility of guiding their people, but also a sacred connection to the spirits that shaped the world. This quiet transformation marked the beginning of a new chapter in the story of ancient Egypt, the rise of the first great leader, the one who would inspire the unification of the two lands. PART6, the first great leader. As the two lands continued to grow and the early myths began to shape the minds and hearts of the people, a new figure quietly emerged along the Nile. It was not a sudden appearance, nor the rise of a conqueror. Instead, it was the slow formation of something deeper, a leader who understood the land, the people, and the quiet forces that guided their lives. His name would be remembered in many forms, sometimes wrapped in legend, sometimes shaped by memory, but his essence remained the same. He was a chief, a unifier, and a visionary. In later centuries, people would speak of him as King Scorpion, a mysterious figure whose symbol, a scorpion carefully carved into stone, would mark the dawn of centralized leadership in Egypt. Before he became a ruler, he was a man of the land, raised among the narrow valleys of Upper Egypt. As a child, he spent hours walking along the riverbanks, watching fishermen cast their nets, farmers prepare their fields, and hunters venture into the desert. He listened to the elders tell ancient stories and watched the priests perform simple rituals meant to honor the forces of the world. These early experiences shaped his understanding of life. Everything was connected, everything depended on the Nile's rhythm, and every person had a role in maintaining balance. When he grew older, Scorpion became known for his calm presence and thoughtful decisions. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. He studied the patterns of the river, the cycle of the seasons, and the movements of animals. He observed how some villages thrived while others struggled, often due not to a lack of effort, but a lack of coordination. He understood that the scattered communities needed unity, not through force, but through cooperation and shared purpose. As years passed, Scorpion gained the respect of nearby settlements. When disagreements arose about water rights or land boundaries, he was called to mediate. When a flood came earlier or later than expected, he helped organize efforts to protect crops and homes. Slowly, he became more than a local chief. He became a guide, someone people trusted. But the world around him was changing. Populations were growing. Villages were expanding. Trade routes were becoming more active. The need for structure, for leadership, became more urgent. Scorpion recognized this before anyone else. He understood that the two lands, especially the southern region, needed to work together, not as isolated settlements, but as parts of a greater whole. Under his guidance, small alliances were formed. Villages began to share resources, coordinate planting cycles, and protect one another from threats. Communication improved, and relationships strengthened. For the first time, communities felt connected beyond their own boundaries. It was during this period of transformation that Scorpion began to adopt symbolic markers of leadership. He wore a white crown, simple at first, but meaningful, representing the land of the south. It was not yet the crown of pharaohs, but an early expression of authority and unity. The scorpion symbol was carved onto pottery, tools, and ceremonial objects, marking the birth of a shared identity. Yet Scorpion was not a ruler who sought power for its own sake. He saw leadership as a duty, a sacred responsibility to maintain harmony between people, land, and the unseen forces that watched over them. He often visited the banks of the Nile at twilight, when the sky turned violet and the water grew still. There, he sought guidance in the quiet, listening to the river as though it spoke to him. Whether it was intuition or wisdom, he seemed to sense what his people needed before they knew it themselves. Under his rule, the southern region grew stronger and more organized. Irrigation systems improved, allowing farmers to control water more effectively. Settlements flourished, protected by a sense of unity rather than fear. Rituals honoring the gods became more structured, reflecting the increasing complexity of society. Everything, from daily life to spiritual practice, began to align under Scorpion's leadership. But the greatest transformation was yet to come. For while Scorpion brought unity to the south, the north remained a separate world, vast, fertile, and independent. Some believe the two lands could never become one. Their differences were too great, their identities too distinct. Yet Scorpion saw what others could not. He envisioned a future in which the two lands worked together, strengthening one another rather than remaining divided. He imagined a single purpose shared by all people along the Nile. It was an idea that would one day reshape history. But before such a dream could become real, a new leader would emerge, one who would take Scorpion's early vision and transform it into the foundation of the first Egyptian kingdom. That leader would be remembered as Narmer, the unifier of Egypt. Part-7, the arrival of Narmer. As the memory of King Scorpion settled gently into the history of the southern lands, a new presence began to rise along the Nile. It was not a sudden shift, nor an abrupt change in the rhythm of life. Instead, it felt almost natural, as though the land itself had been preparing for this moment. Villages were growing, trade routes expanding, and the need for unity becoming stronger with every passing season. It was within this evolving world that a young leader named Narmer first stepped into the light. Narmer was not born into chaos or war. He grew up in a world already influenced by the efforts of Scorpion and the leaders before him. The southern region, known as Upper Egypt, had become more organized, more connected, and more confident. Narmer inherited a society that was ready for something greater, something more ambitious than anything attempted before. Even as a young boy, he observed life along the Nile with remarkable focus. He watched how farmers prepared their fields, how traders negotiated along the riverbanks, how craftsmen shaped stone and pottery with patience and skill. He paid attention to the rituals performed by the priests, the stories told by elders, and the symbols carved into early monuments. Every detail fascinated him, and every memory shaped his understanding of the world. As he grew older, Narmer developed a presence that was calm and steady. He carried himself with quiet determination, often speaking only when necessary, yet always choosing his words wisely. People quickly noticed his ability to understand problems from different angles and his intuition for leadership. He seemed able to sense the needs of his people, just as he could sense the rhythm of the Nile. This natural wisdom earned him respect long before he ever held a formal title. Soon, Narmer found himself surrounded by advisors, craftsmen, farmers, and priests who believed in his vision. Unlike many leaders who relied on displays of strength, Narmer built his influence through connection and clarity. He listened more than he spoke, and when he finally shared his ideas, they carried the weight of thoughtful observation. It was during this time that Narmer began to look beyond the southern region. He studied the maps etched into clay, showing where the Nile spread into the wide delta of the north. He listened to travelers who returned from distant lands, carrying stories of the fertile fields of Lower Egypt, the marshes rich with wildlife, and the thriving trade routes extending toward the Mediterranean. The north was a place of possibility, but also a land of independence. Its leaders were strong and proud, and its traditions ran deep. For generations, Upper and Lower Egypt had existed as separate worlds, connected only by the river that flowed between them. Some believed the separation was natural and permanent, but Narmer saw something different. He saw potential. Two worlds that, if joined, could form a civilization unlike anything seen before. Narmer did not begin his journey with the desire for conquest. Instead, he felt guided by the idea of balance. He believed that the two lands were like the two sides of a single life, different, yet complementary. separate, yet destined to come together. He envisioned a future where the strength of the South and the abundance of the North worked in harmony, but he also understood that such unity could never be achieved through force alone. It required something deeper: trust, respect, and a shared identity powerful enough to rise above regional differences. To prepare for this, Narmer strengthened the South even further. He encouraged skilled craftsmen to produce pottery, tools, and ceremonial objects of exceptional quality. He supported the expansion of irrigation systems, ensuring stable harvests. He met regularly with village elders to maintain harmony and cooperation. The South grew stronger, more organized, and more unified than ever before. Yet Narmer also reached outward, establishing peaceful contact with the North. He invited northern traders to southern markets and welcomed their goods into his economy. He listened to their concerns, learned their customs, and observed their symbols. Over time, the people of the North began to respect him, even if they did not yet follow him. The foundation for unity was slowly taking shape. As the seasons passed, Narmer became known not only in Upper Egypt, but throughout the entire Nile Valley. His symbol, a powerful catfish paired with a chisel, began to appear on ceremonial objects, signaling the emergence of a leader who would soon redefine history. Yet Narmer remained patient. He understood that true unity required careful timing. He waited for the right moment, when the people of both lands would feel ready to embrace something greater than their individual traditions. That moment was nearing, and when it finally arrived, it would change the course of Egyptian civilization forever. Part 8, The Path to Unification. As Narmer's influence continued to grow, the world along the Nile entered a quiet, expectant period. It was as though the river itself sensed that something significant was approaching. The people of Upper Egypt were confident, organized, and united under Narmer's calm leadership. The people of Lower Egypt, though independent and proud, had begun to feel the pull of a larger destiny. And through it all, Narmer observed the land with a steady gaze, waiting for the moment when the two lands could finally move toward one another. Narmer's path to unification did not begin with conflict, but with understanding. He knew that the North, with its vast marshlands and wide horizon, valued freedom and autonomy. Its leaders were accustomed to ruling over fertile fields and intricate waterways, and they held tightly to their traditions. The South, shaped by its narrow valleys and protective cliffs, valued order, cooperation, and structure. If these two worlds were to become one, they needed a reason to trust one another. Narmer worked patiently to build that trust. He strengthened trade routes between the regions, ensuring that goods moved freely along the Nile. Farmers in the North began to depend on southern stone tools, while craftsmen in the South grew to appreciate the grains and resources of the Delta. Boats traveled more frequently, carrying not only goods but stories, customs, and friendships. Every exchange, no matter how small, helped the people see each other not as strangers, but as partners in the same unfolding story. Narmer also made symbolic gestures. He sent gifts to northern chiefs, carefully carved pottery, fine linen, and small ceremonial items marked with his royal symbols. These were not displays of power, but messages of respect. In return, northern communities sent offerings of their own: woven baskets, clay containers filled with seeds, and reeds shaped into delicate ornaments. These gestures traveled the river like quiet conversations, slowly weaving a connection between the two lands. Yet, unification required more than goodwill. It required stability. Narmer ensured that the South remained strong, reinforcing alliances between villages and maintaining peace. He listened carefully to the concerns of his people and worked closely with advisors and priests to preserve harmony. The stronger the South became, the more confidently it could extend a hand toward the North. Over time, signs began to appear that the moment for unity was drawing near. Messengers from the Delta reported growing interest in Narmer's leadership. Northern traders began adopting Southern symbols on their goods, acknowledging his influence. Even the priests in the North, keepers of ancient rituals and guardians of tradition, started to speak of a possible future where the two lands acted as one. Narmer sensed that the land was ready, but he knew that unification could not be achieved without a clear and undeniable moment, a moment that would mark the beginning of a new era. He prepared carefully, gathering trusted allies and listening to the river's rhythm as he had done since childhood. He did not rush the process. He waited for conditions to align naturally, just as a farmer waits for the right moment to plant seeds. When the time finally came, it was not with the roar of armies, but with the steady determination of a leader guided by purpose. Narmer's presence moved northward, not as a conqueror seeking control, but as a unifier carrying a vision of balance. His arrival was met with curiosity, caution, and eventually respect. Some northern leaders resisted, holding tightly to their independence. Others welcomed him, recognizing the strength and stability he brought. Through negotiation, diplomacy, and careful action, Narmer gradually established his authority in the Delta. The process was not quick. It unfolded like the unfolding of a long Nile season, steady, patient, and inevitable. Step by step, symbol by symbol, the two lands drew closer. People began to speak of a unified Egypt, not as a dream, but as a coming reality. The idea spread across villages, carried by travelers, whispered by priests, and felt by families along the riverbanks. And then, one day, the moment of unification finally arrived. Narmer stood as the ruler of both Upper and Lower Egypt, wearing the symbols of each land with quiet pride. The process had required diplomacy, strength, and vision, but above all, harmony with the land and its people. The two lands were no longer divided. They had become one, united under a single leader, guided by a single purpose, and prepared to enter a new chapter in their history. But unification was only the beginning. What came next would define the identity of Egypt for thousands of years. A new system of rule, a new symbol of power, and a new era that would shape the ancient world. Part 9. The birth of the first pharaoh. With the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt complete, a new sense of calm settled across the Nile Valley. Villages that once stood apart now felt connected. Trade moved smoothly between regions. Rituals began to share common symbols, and people started to speak of Egypt not as two lands, but as one unified home. And at the center of this new harmony stood Narmer, ready to take on a role that had never existed before. Up to this point in history, leaders had been chiefs, warriors, or regional rulers. Their power came from alliances, respect, or local traditions. But Narmer's accomplishment was unlike anything seen before. He had brought together vast territories, diverse communities, and different customs under a single vision. This required a new identity, one strong enough to represent both the South and the North, one powerful enough to embody unity itself. Slowly, gently, this identity began to take shape. It started with a simple idea. If the two lands were now one, then their leader must also be one, not a king of the South or a king of the North, but the ruler of all Egypt. And so, the concept of the pharaoh began to form. Narmer's transformation into the first pharaoh did not happen in a single moment. It emerged through ceremonies, rituals, and symbols that gradually grew in importance. The most iconic of these symbols was the double crown, a combination of the tall white crown of Upper Egypt and the curved red crown of Lower Egypt. When worn together, they created a powerful message: unity, balance, and harmony between the two lands. Narmer's calm presence made the symbol feel natural, as if Egypt had always been destined to stand as one. The priests played an important role in this transformation. They understood that a united Egypt needed more than a political leader. It needed a spiritual anchor. They began to describe the pharaoh not only as a ruler chosen by people, but as a figure chosen by the gods, someone who stood between the human world and the divine. This belief did not place Narmer above ordinary people. Instead, it tied him to the sacred forces that shaped daily life: the Nile, the sun, the stars, and the eternal cycle of seasons. To reflect this sacred connection, new rituals were introduced. Narmer participated in ceremonies beside the river, honoring the gods who brought life to the land. He held festivals celebrating renewal and abundance. In each ritual, the double crown appeared as a reminder that Egypt was no longer divided. These traditions gave the people a sense of stability, helping them understand that unification was not just a political event, but the birth of a new era. As Narmer settled into his role, Egypt began to flourish. With a single leader guiding the land, communication improved across vast distances. Irrigation systems became more coordinated, allowing farmers to plan according to the rising and falling of the river. Craftsmen worked under a shared cultural vision, producing pottery, jewelry, and tools that reflected a unified identity. Even language began to shift, with symbols and markings evolving into more structured forms that would eventually become the famous hieroglyphs. Yet what made Narmer truly remarkable was not his power, but his patience. He did not try to change Egypt overnight. Instead, he allowed traditions to grow naturally, guided by the needs and beliefs of the people. He understood that unity could not be forced. It had to be nurtured, season after season, just like the crops that grew along the Nile. Over time, as his leadership strengthened, people began to speak of him with a mixture of respect and reverence. To them, he was more than a king. He was the living symbol of Egypt's harmony. His actions shaped the land, his decisions brought peace, and his presence connected two worlds that had once been separate. This gentle, powerful role became the essence of what it meant to be a pharaoh. By the time his reign reached its height, Narmer had created a foundation that future generations would build upon for thousands of years. He was remembered not only for uniting the two lands, but for becoming the first pharaoh, the figure who embodied order, balance, and the eternal spirit of Egypt. But his achievements were only the beginning. As Egypt settled into its new identity, new forms of art, writing, and architecture began to emerge, expressions of a civilization discovering itself. And among these developments, early writing would become one of the most transformative. PART 10, the dawn of writing. As Narmer guided Egypt into a new era of unity, a quiet transformation began to take shape across the two lands. Something subtle at first, almost invisible, yet destined to become one of the greatest achievements in human history. It started with simple marks, scratches on pottery, symbols carved into stone, and signs painted onto jars meant to show ownership or origin. But slowly, these markings evolved into something far more powerful, the beginnings of writing. Life in a united Egypt had become more complex. Trade flowed constantly along the Nile, carrying grain, tools, cloth, and precious materials from one region to another. Farmers needed to track harvests, temple workers needed to record offerings, and leaders needed a way to manage resources across vast distances. Spoken words, no matter how carefully expressed, disappeared into the air. Memories faded. But symbols, quiet, patient symbols, could endure. At first, these symbols were little more than pictures. A fish represented a fish, a jar represented a jar, a bird represented a bird. They were simple, almost childlike, but they carried meaning. Over time, these drawings became more consistent, more refined. Craftsmen learned to give each symbol a clear shape so that anyone who saw it would understand its meaning. A language was beginning to grow, not spoken, but carved and painted. Scribes emerged from this transformation. They were not yet the highly trained scholars they would one day become, but curious individuals with steady hands and sharp attention to detail. They observed the early symbols, memorized them, and practiced recreating them on clay, wood, and stone. These early scribes understood that symbols held power, that preserving information allowed Egypt to think beyond the limits of memory. Temples became centers of this new knowledge. Priests, already guardians of rituals and tradition, recognized the importance of writing. They encouraged scribes to record offerings, festival dates, and stories of creation. The walls of sacred structures slowly filled with symbols that, though still primitive, captured the beliefs and daily life of the people. Every line carved into stone was a step towards something extraordinary. The riverbanks echoed with the soft tapping of stones against hard surfaces. Clay tablets dried in the sun, carrying marks that would last for centuries. In the quiet workshops of the South, craftsmen experimented with new tools. Sharpened reeds dipped in pigments made from crushed minerals, allowing symbols to be drawn with more grace and fluidity. What once required carving could now be painted, expanding the possibilities of expression. As writing evolved, something remarkable happened. The symbols no longer represented only objects. They began to represent sounds, ideas, and names. With this shift, early writing transformed into a true language. It grew richer, more flexible, capable of expressing complex thoughts. The first names of kings appeared, carefully drawn to honor their memory. The stories of the gods took shape, linking the physical world with the spiritual one. The land itself gained a voice. Narmer recognized the importance of this new system. He encouraged its development, understanding that writing could support unity and strengthen the foundations of the state. Through writing, laws could be remembered, traditions preserved, and achievements recorded. Egypt was no longer a civilization carried only by memory. It was a civilization carried by ink, stone, and the hands of dedicated scribes. The people began to feel the effects of this transformation. Farmers used marks to track seasons and harvests. Traders labeled goods with symbols showing their origin. Priests organized festivals with written calendars. Life shifted from a world where knowledge lived only in stories to a world where knowledge could be preserved forever. And all along the river, on pots, stones, and walls, these early symbols glowed softly in the sunlight. They were the seeds of what would one day become hieroglyphs, one of the most beautiful and enduring writing systems ever created. At this early stage, writing was still simple, still growing, still learning to speak, yet it carried within it the promise of all the stories Egypt would one day tell, the stories of kings, gods, victories, beliefs, and daily life. With the dawn of writing, Egypt stepped into the world of memory and meaning. Every symbol carved was a breath of the past, preserved for the future. And as this new form of expression spread across the two lands, It laid the foundation for the next great transformation, the rise of monumental architecture. PART 11. The First Temples of Stone. As the early symbols of writing spread across the two lands, another quiet transformation began to rise from the earth, one made not of words or ideas, but of stone. Egypt, now united under Narmer's calm leadership, felt stronger and more connected than ever before. With unity came confidence, and with confidence came a new desire, the desire to build structures that would stand far beyond the life of any ruler, structures that could honor the gods, protect traditions, and anchor the identity of a growing civilization. These early temples did not yet resemble the grand monuments that would one day dominate the desert horizon. They began as simple gatherings, places where the people of the Nile brought offerings to the forces that shaped their lives. At first, these shrines were made of reeds, wood, and mud brick. They blended with the landscape, quiet and modest, much like the early stories of the gods themselves. Yet, as Egypt expanded, so did the vision behind these sacred spaces. The priests, now keepers of writing and ritual, recognized the importance of creating places that would last. They understood that if Egypt was to honor its gods properly, it needed temples that could withstand floods, time, and change. So they turned to the one material that had already shaped the life of the South: stone. The choice was not only practical, it was symbolic. Stone felt eternal, strong and unmovable, just like the cycle of the sun or the steady flow of the Nile. By carving temples from stone, Egypt could express a sense of permanence that matched its growing identity. And so, the first stone temples began to rise. Along the riverbanks, craftsmen worked with incredible patience. They used tools made of copper and stone, shaping blocks with slow, rhythmic movements. Each tap echoed through the desert air, blending with the sound of the wind and the distant calls of birds. These early builders were not rushing. They were creating something meant to last forever, something that would become a physical link between the human world and the divine. The first stone temples were small and simple. Their walls were thick, their shapes rectangular, and their entrances aligned carefully with the sun. Inside, they held quiet spaces where priests performed daily rituals, offering bread, water, incense, and simple gifts to the gods. These rituals did not involve large crowds or grand ceremonies. They were private, intimate acts of devotion that kept the balance of the world intact. Despite their simplicity, these temples carried immense meaning. They marked the beginning of Egypt's architectural journey, a journey that would one day lead to towering pyramids, vast ceremonial complexes, and statues carved with breathtaking precision. But in this early period, the focus was not grandeur, it was stability. These temples were symbols of order, representing Egypt's new identity as a unified land under a single ruler. As stone structures became more common, the role of architecture expanded. Temples became places of gathering, learning, and record-keeping. Priests stored the earliest written texts inside, protecting them from the elements. Scribes came to study the symbols they carved. Leaders visited to seek guidance, offer thanks, or connect with the spiritual forces believed to oversee the land. The people, too, felt the change. Even those who never entered the inner sanctuaries saw the temples as markers of belonging. They were reminders that Egypt was no longer a collection of scattered villages, but a nation with shared beliefs, shared symbols, and a shared future. At dawn, sunlight touched the stones with warm, golden light. At night, the stars shone above them like watchful eyes. These early temples became part of the natural rhythm of life along the Nile, rising steadily as Egypt entered its next stage of evolution. And while these first stone structures were only the beginning, they paved the way for something even greater, a vision of leadership and divine connection that would shape the centuries to come. For these temples were not built only for the gods. They were built to reflect a new understanding that the pharaoh was not just a ruler, but the living link between earth and sky. This belief, still forming quietly in the hearts of the people, would soon give rise to one of Egypt's most important concepts, the divine kingship. PART 12, the pharaoh as a living god. As stone temples began rising along the banks of the Nile, another idea quietly took shape in the minds of the people. Soft at first, like a whisper carried by wind, but slowly becoming one of the most defining beliefs of Egyptian civilization. It was the idea that the king, the pharaoh, was not merely a ruler, not simply a leader chosen by men, but a bridge between the human world and the divine. Life in Egypt depended on balance, the balance between the river and the desert, between the seasons, between order and chaos. This balance, which the Egyptians called Maat, felt fragile, precious, and essential. Someone had to protect it. Someone had to ensure that the floods came on time, that the harvests sustained the people, and that the gods remained at peace. Over time, the pharaoh became that someone. At first, the king was seen simply as a chosen guardian, a man entrusted with sacred responsibility. But as Egypt grew, its temples rising, its rituals deepening, its identity strengthening, the role of the pharaoh evolved. He was no longer only a guardian of balance. He became part of the balance itself. People began to see him as a living embodiment of divine presence, a physical manifestation of the God's will on earth. This transformation did not happen suddenly. It unfolded slowly through stories, symbols, ceremonies, and the quiet power of tradition. Priests described the pharaoh as the son of the sun, protected by divine forces, blessed with wisdom beyond ordinary men. Artists carved him wearing the crowns of the two lands, symbols of unity. Scribes recorded his actions not as simple political decisions, but as sacred deeds meant to preserve harmony. The Egyptians did not imagine the pharaoh as a distant, unreachable deity. Instead, they saw him as a being who lived between worlds, human enough to understand his people, yet divine enough to speak for the gods. This dual identity gave him immense authority, but also immense responsibility. If the Nile failed, if drought struck, if conflicts erupted, people believed the harmony of the world had been disturbed, and restoring that harmony became the pharaoh's duty. Rituals developed to reinforce this connection. During ceremonies, the pharaoh offered gifts to the gods on behalf of all of Egypt: food, incense, water, and praise. He performed symbolic acts that ensured the rising of the sun and the renewal of life. When he appeared in public, he represented more than himself. He represented order, stability, and the promise that Egypt would endure. This belief in the pharaoh's divine nature created a unique kind of unity. People across the two lands, from farmers to fishermen, from craftsmen to merchants, felt connected through their ruler. Even those who never saw the pharaoh in person felt his presence through statues, festivals, and the stories told by priests. He became a symbol of what Egypt was and what it aspired to be. With divine kingship came a new vision of leadership. The pharaoh was expected to protect the weak, feed the hungry, and keep the peace. His justice was not merely political, but sacred. His decisions were considered reflections of cosmic order. And when he passed away, Egyptians believed his spirit ascended to the realm of the gods, while his successor continued his role on earth, ensuring that the cycle of kingship never broke. This idea shaped everything: art, architecture, religion, and daily life. It inspired the building of temples, the creation of myths, and eventually, the construction of monuments so grand they would stand for thousands of years. Divine kingship became the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization, its spiritual center and its guiding light. But as Egypt grew more confident in this belief, a new desire awakened, one that would push the limits of imagination and reshape the land forever. If the pharaoh was a living god, then his resting place after death had to reflect that divine nature. It had to be monumental, eternal, a beacon rising from the desert sands. And so, slowly but inevitably, the dream of building something unlike anything the world had ever seen began to form, the dream of the first pyramids. PART 13, The Rise of the First Tombs. With the idea of divine kingship now deeply rooted in Egyptian life, a new chapter opened, one centered on the question of what happened to a pharaoh after death. If the king was a living link between earth and the divine, what became of that link once his earthly life ended? The Egyptians believed that death was not an ending, but a transition, a quiet passage from one form of existence to another. And for a pharaoh, that passage had to be treated with extraordinary care. In the earliest days, the tombs of rulers were modest. They were simple pits dug into the desert, covered with wooden planks or stone slabs, marked by a few offerings. But as Egypt's beliefs deepened, these early resting places began to feel insufficient. A divine being could not simply disappear into the sand. His journey to the afterlife needed protection, guidance, and respect. Thus began the evolution of royal tombs. The first step in this transformation was the creation of mastabas. These were flat-roofed, rectangular structures built above underground burial chambers. Made of mud brick or stone, mastabas stood low and wide, resembling benches, solid, sturdy, and purposeful. Their walls protected the tomb beneath, shielding it from animals, shifting sands, and the harsh desert sun. Inside, offerings were placed with care: jars of grain and beer, tools for daily life, small treasures meant to accompany the king into eternity. As time passed, mastabas grew more spacious and organized. Rooms were added for ceremonies, storage, and family members. Walls were smoothed, decorated, and sometimes painted. Craftsmen carved small niches where priests could leave food or recite prayers, ensuring that the king's spirit remained nourished in the world beyond. These structures were more than graves. They were bridges between worlds, quiet places where the living could speak to the dead. But the Egyptians were not content with simply protecting the body. They wanted to honor the pharaoh in a way that matched his divine role. The desert, vast and untouched, offered space and inspiration. Builders and priests began asking themselves a question that would change Egypt forever. If a pharaoh was connected to the gods, shouldn't his tomb reflect that connection? Shouldn't it point upward, toward the sky, toward eternity? This question sparked creativity and ambition. Mastabas became larger and more sophisticated. Architects studied the desert landscape, observing how sun, wind, and sand interacted with stone. They experimented with new building techniques, learning how to stack and shape materials more precisely. Each improvement brought Egypt closer to a monumental breakthrough. But even before the pyramids were born, these early tombs played an essential role. They were laboratories of imagination, places where ideas took shape and grew. They helped craftsmen master stone cutting. They taught builders how to reinforce walls and create stable foundations. They allowed priests to refine rituals connected to burial, resurrection, and divine protection. The mastaba served as the first symbol of a pharaoh's eternal presence. It was a quiet declaration that a king's existence did not end with his final breath. His role continued, guiding, protecting, and maintaining balance from the world beyond. And so, each mastaba became a promise carved into the desert. Egypt would endure, and its leaders would live on. Families of nobles and high officials, inspired by the king's tombs, began constructing their own mastabas. This created entire fields of stone structures, arranged neatly in rows like silent cities of the dead. These necropolises, cities of the dead, became places of memory, reverence, and tradition. They reflected not sorrow, but continuity. Yet, even as mastabas multiplied, a quiet and ambitious idea was spreading among Egypt's architects and spiritual leaders. They believed they could create something more, something that reached higher, lasted longer, and expressed the pharaoh's divine nature in a way that mastabas never could. This dream would soon erupt into reality, and it would begin with a single visionary, a man whose creativity would change architecture forever, Imhotep. Part 14, Imhotep's Vision. As Egypt entered a new era of confidence and unity, one man emerged whose ideas would reshape the very face of the desert. His name was Imhotep, a figure both brilliant and mysterious, remembered as an architect, a priest, a healer, and eventually, as the centuries passed, a symbol of wisdom itself. In his lifetime, he served under Pharaoh Djoser, a ruler of the early 3rd dynasty, and together they would create something the world had never seen. Imhotep was born into a society already rich with tradition. He grew up surrounded by mastabas, temples, rituals, and the hum of daily life along the Nile. But while others saw these structures as the natural limits of architecture, Imhotep saw possibilities. He studied the way the sun moved across the sky, observed how shadows stretched across the ground, and listened to the stories told by priests and elders. He understood the beliefs that shaped Egypt, the values of balance and eternity, and deep inside, an idea began to form, quiet at first, but growing. At this time, Pharaoh Djoser sought a tomb worthy of his role as a divine ruler. The mastabas of earlier kings were respectable, strong, even elegant, but they no longer felt sufficient. Egypt was evolving, its ambitions were expanding, and Djoser wanted his tomb to reflect both his power and his connection to the gods. When Imhotep was chosen as the chief architect, he did not simply think about building another mastaba. Instead, he saw an opportunity to transform burial architecture entirely. He believed that if a mastaba symbolized stability, then a series of mastabas, stacked in decreasing sizes, could symbolize ascent, a path upward, a bridge reaching toward the heavens. It was a daring idea, one without precedent, one that challenged everything builders believed was possible. But Imhotep was not intimidated. He began by studying the properties of stone. While earlier builders used mud brick or small limestone blocks, Imhotep envisioned using larger, carefully carved stones that could support weight, endure centuries, and remain stable even under shifting desert sands. He directed workers to experiment with cutting, shaping, and transporting these heavier blocks. The process was slow, methodical, and demanding, but each attempt brought new insights. Imhotep understood that the key to innovation was patience. Nothing rushed would last, and this tomb, this structure he dreamed of, was meant to last forever. As plans took shape, Imhotep proposed something unheard of, a 6-level stepped structure, rising layer by layer like a staircase into the sky. It would be unlike any tomb Egypt had ever known, taller, grander, and infused with symbolism. Each level would represent a stage of ascent. Each step would bring the pharaoh closer to the gods, even after death. Djoser accepted the vision. And so, construction began. The desert came alive with movement. Workers carved limestone blocks from nearby quarries, dragging them with ropes and wooden sledges. Foremen called out instructions. Tools clinked rhythmically against stone. Dust rose into the air, catching the sunlight in shimmering clouds. For miles around, one could hear the echoes of Egypt's first monumental experiment. Imhotep supervised every detail. He adjusted angles, refined measurements, and observed how each layer interacted with the one beneath it. His intuition guided the process as much as his knowledge. He understood that architecture was not merely engineering. It was a dialogue between material, space, and belief. Day by day, the structure grew. First one level, then another still. People traveling along the Nile began to see something extraordinary rising from the desert's edge, a shape unlike anything on Earth. It seemed to defy nature, reaching upward as if determined to touch the sky. This was no longer just a tomb. It was the beginning of a revolution. The Step Pyramid of Djoser would become the first true monumental stone building in history, a declaration that Egypt had entered a new age. A symbol of the pharaoh's divine nature, and a testament to Imhotep's vision, a vision rooted in patience, belief, and the quiet confidence that the impossible could be achieved with enough care. But as the pyramid rose, its significance deepened. It became more than a structure. It became an idea that would inspire generations of architects, priests, and rulers, pushing them to dream even bigger, even higher. For in the mind of Imhotep, this was only the beginning. PART 15, the Step Pyramid rises. As the years passed, and the workers continued their quiet, determined labor, the Step Pyramid grew taller, stronger, and more astonishing with every layer of stone added. From a distance, it looked like a staircase carved into the sky, 6 great steps rising from the desert floor, each one slightly smaller than the one beneath it. No one in Egypt, or anywhere else in the ancient world, had ever seen anything like it. The landscape itself seemed transformed, as though the earth had reached upward and frozen in mid-motion. Around the pyramid, the desert buzzed with activity. Thousands of workers moved in long, steady lines, transporting limestone blocks on sledges gliding over sand made slick with water. Overseers walked among them, keeping rhythm and pace. The sound of chisels tapping stone echoed across the desert, blending with the wind and the distant rush of the Nile. This music of construction became part of daily life, a reminder that Egypt was building something more enduring than any memory. Imhotep, the architect who had imagined this new form, was everywhere, walking the perimeter, studying shadows, testing the feel of stone beneath his hands. He spoke softly to foremen, adjusted angles with patient confidence, and watched each stage with calm intensity. He knew the weight of what he was creating. This was not just a tomb. It was the unfolding of a new idea. That stone could reach toward eternity. As the pyramid neared completion, it became clear that the structure was more than a grand monument. It was a full complex, a small city of stone built to honor the pharaoh in life, in death, and in the eternal world beyond. Surrounding the pyramid were chapels, courtyards, ceremonial halls, and towering walls carved with beautiful niches. Long corridors led to hidden chambers. Ritual spaces were designed for festivals and offerings. Priests moved through these rooms with reverence, preparing for future ceremonies that would take place long after their own lifetimes. Every part of the complex served a purpose. Every stone carried meaning. The design reflected Egyptian beliefs about rebirth, order, and the unbroken cycle of life. The whole complex felt like a bridge between worlds, solid, silent, and timeless. When the final stone was laid at the top of the pyramid, the workers paused. For the first time in years, the air felt still. What they had created was more than a structure. It was a statement, a message, a promise carved into the earth. The pharaoh would endure. Egypt would endure. Djoser himself visited the site, walking through the gates of the complex with a quiet sense of awe. He had commissioned a tomb, but Imhotep had given him a legacy, one that would outlast not only his reign, but entire dynasties. People looked upon the pharaoh with even deeper reverence, seeing the pyramid as a reflection of his divine nature, his power, and his eternal presence. As the sun set behind the pyramid, long shadows stretched across the desert. The limestone glowed softly in the fading light, warming to gold and then cooling to silver as night approached. Stars appeared above, glittering like distant guardians. The step pyramid stood steady, unmoved, as though it had always been there. From that moment on, Egypt understood something fundamental. Stone could create eternity. And if one pyramid could rise from the desert, others could rise too, bigger, smoother, more ambitious. The age of mastabas was ending. The age of pyramids was beginning. The step pyramid of Djoser became the foundation for everything that would follow. The great pyramids of Giza, the temples of later dynasties, the architectural legacy that would captivate the world for thousands of years. And it all began with a single vision, a single ruler, and a single step into the sky. Thank you for watching this episode. We've reached the end of this first chapter of ancient Egypt's story, from the early kings to the rise of the very first pyramid. But this is only the beginning. In the next video, we'll continue exploring Egypt's evolution and follow the incredible journey that led to even greater monuments and a civilization that lasted for thousands of years. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the next part, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the continuation of the story. See you soon for the next chapter.